You're tuned into the hottest paranormal life show on YouTube, Into the Fringe, where we discuss lost civilizations, UFOs, cryptids, unsolved mysteries, megalithic structures, extraterrestrials, interdimensional portals, time skips, and more. Don't change that channel, because now you are leaving the mainstream and entering into the fringe. Greetings, followers. It is I, Cardinal Sin, and welcome to another episode of Into the Fringe. This is episode number 43 with Kathleen Marden, and I will read her bio. Kathleen Marden is an author, on-camera expert, international conference presenter, experiencer advocate, and hypnosis practitioner. Since 1990, she has researched the perplexing nature of UFOs and the non-human entities associated with highly advanced aerial vehicles via her own groundbreaking research, investigation, and experimentation. Her research has extended to archival collections and the U.S. government's involvement in the investigation of UFOs and its major studies. This has combined to give her a depth of knowledge that few possess. She is the 2021 recipient of the International UFO Congress Lifetime Achievement Award, whose shirt I am wearing. For 30 years, she engaged in groundbreaking, scientifically focused research on ET experiencers and the history of government involvement in major UFO studies and the government cover-up. During this time, she was closely associated with the Mutual UFO Network as its director of the Experiencer Research Team and the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters as a research consultant and advisory board member. Her interest in UFOs and contact began in 1961 when her aunt and uncle Betty and Barney Hill had a close encounter and subsequent abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. She has conducted an extensive multi-year investigation of their experiences. The 60th anniversary edition of her book, Captured, The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, is available now. Her first 5 books are available in all formats at fine online bookstores everywhere. Autographed copies can be purchased in the USA at www.kathleen-marden.com. Welcome, Kathleen Marden, to Into the Fringe.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Let's check in with our chat here and see who we have. So Alexis Hood is here. Hello. Canadian Spider-Man is here. Cookie Stringfellow is here. Ivan Ivanovich is here. Hello. The lovely Sherry is here. Wookie Fever 1969. Hail. And that appears to be everyone so far. And let's go ahead and jump into some questions. So Kathleen, a lot of people know you as the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, but they don't know you. What can you tell us about your background and how you became active in the field of UFO and abduction research?
Well, I became interested in this field when I was 13 years old, and my aunt called my mother and told her that the previous evening they had been driving through upstate New Hampshire, returning home from vacation, when they had a close-up sighting of flying saucer, is what they called them in those days. Mm-hmm. And she was concerned because she and Barney came so close to that craft, she thought they might have been contaminated. And so my mother offered to call a neighbor who was a physicist to ask for advice. Now, I was there we were a close family. Betty and Barney lived 20 miles away from my childhood home. I saw them at least once a week, sometimes more often than that. And I admired my Aunt Betty greatly. She was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, and also she and Barney were very much involved in politics in the state, and they served as really good mentors and guides for me. And so I went to college and I studied social work. I was going to be a psychiatric social worker, but my first husband and I moved to Cincinnati. I graduated from college in New Hampshire, UNH. And when I arrived in Cincinnati, I couldn't get a job as a psychiatric social worker. So I decided to take a job teaching. And I did graduate work in education at that point. But I never lost my interest in UFOs and contact. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to do my own investigation of my aunt and uncle's case. I had met or a great many of the early investigators, such as Walter Webb from NICAP, Dr. Alan Hynek, Jacques Vallée, Dr. Benjamin Simon. I had dinner at his home with Betty and Barney, Dr. Alan Hynek, and also John Fuller, who wrote The Interrupted Journey, the first book that was written on their case. And so I just thought for years and years how I wanted to be a professional writer. That's what I was going to do in college. But my Aunt Betty said, give it up. You'll never make a living as a writer. Do something practical. Become a social worker like me. So, I said, well, okay. She said, you'll have a salary and you'll have benefits and a retirement plan. And so I followed her advice. I respected her advice. And then, over time, after teaching and being an education services coordinator for 14 years, I burned out and just working way too many hours. And I became ill. And I decided at that time that I really required some intellectual stimulation. And I thought to myself, well, what better thing to do than to follow my bliss? I'd been listening to Joseph Campbell on PBS. And
I love that Joseph Campbell show.
Yes, I did too. And that's what he was advising. And then, Confucius says, if you do something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. That's right. I thought, this is something I love. I've always had a passion for writing, and I'm going to learn to become an investigator and a writer. So that's what I did. And I ended up I started this in 1990, but the first book was published in 2007. My Aunt Betty died in 2004. She knew I was writing her biography. Mm-hmm. I'd interviewed her. I'd done investigations. I'd gone to the abduction site along the route time and time again. I had all of the archival records. I'd talked to many of those who were still living, who were the original investigators. Mm-hmm. And so I asked Stanton Friedman if he would like to join me in writing the part on the star map. And a lot of people don't know that his first major accomplishment in this field was to bring about the scientific investigation of my Aunt Betty Hill's star map that she drew as the result of a post-hypnotic suggestion from Dr. Benjamin Simon. this psychiatrist who was working with Betty and Barney to resolve some anxiety that Betty was experiencing. But Barney had been in the hospital with bleeding ulcers, and he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. That's what we call it today.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Simon was a very good neuropsychiatrist, very good for Barney in helping him to work through his trauma, but also worked with Betty. And Betty, when she was on the craft, was describing how she had lost her fear of this non-human entity, and that she called the leader. And she said to him, "I know you're not from around here. Where are you from?" And so in hypnosis, she said that he had done something to the wall, and he had produced this sort of three-dimensional star map. And there were stars of different colors and sizes, and some were connected by solid lines and some by dotted lines. And she was made to understand that the solid lines were trade routes and the dotted lines were expeditions. And so the leader said to her, "Where are you on this map?" And she said, "I don't know. I don't know much about the universe." And he said, "Well, if you don't know where you are, how can I tell you where I am? There's no reference point there." And so she said that under hypnosis, and Dr. Simon said, "Well, if you can remember this accurately, and it doesn't bother you too badly, go home and see if you can sketch what this looked like." So she was taking a three-dimensional map and putting it down on with paper and pencil, and did the best she could. And Stanton was called in to investigate a brilliant woman from Ohio's investigation of Betty's star map. Took her several years to identify the stars on the map.
And this would be Marjorie Fish, of course.
Marjorie Fish, yes, absolutely. So it took her several years, and she finally found a match. And that match was only found after our technology had advanced, so that we had better distance data and more information on those stars. And then she had a match, and she needed scientists who could vet her work. So Stanton was called in as a scientist to meet with her, and also to find astrophysicists who would vet her work. And those who did discovered that it was accurate. Not only that, but the stars on that map had special properties. All of the stars connected by lines on Betty's map are sun-like stars, even though only 5% of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood are sun-like, out 54 light years. And all of the sun-like stars in that volume of space are on Betty's map. So one of the physicists even who studied this said that if we were scientists or astronauts from the star system, Zeta Reticuli, and we wanted to explore the local galactic neighborhood, that route is precisely the route that we would take. It's logical. All of the stars are in a plane, which means that it's easier to go from star to star rather than, bouncing around. Stanton used to say, like raisins in a loaf of raisin bread, as opposed to pepperoni on a pizza. He had a good way of explaining it. So I asked Stanton to write about his work with Marjorie and with Betty and with the other scientists that he found to vet the star map. And he also wrote a chapter on disinformants and debunkers.
Yeah.
He was very, very good at that too, and he taught me a lot about them.
I bet. How old were you when their abduction occurred, and what do you remember?
I was 13 years old, and I remember getting off the school bus and going into the house, and my mother was on the phone. I even remember that she had the ironing board set up. I must have been shocked to have that memory today, all these years later, because she was talking to Betty, and I could hear the concern in her voice. And my mother hung up the phone, and then she explained to me what had happened and how she was going to call our neighbor, who was a physicist. And within a couple of days, my parents and my two brothers and I drove to Betty's and Barney's house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was about 20 miles from my childhood home. And I got to hear the account from Betty herself, and to see shiny spots on the trunk of the car that hadn't been there the day before this happened, or even on the day that this happened during the daytime. But when they arrived home, they were there. And not only were they there, but they caused a compass needle to rotate rapidly, indicating a magnetic field. So that was quite an experience to hear that. Barney sat quietly in a corner of the living room with my father. My father later told me that Barney was very clear about the non-human entities that he saw when he was standing in a field in Lincoln, New Hampshire, looking through binoculars up through the windows of this craft that was hovering only about 100 feet above him. So it was a very interesting day, and Barney was expecting a call back from Pease Air Force Base. He and Betty had already made a report, a Project Blue Book report. And so that's what I remember from that early time. And I wasn't frightened then. I became very, very interested in studying astronomy. And my father bought me a telescope, and we would go out and look at the stars at night and identify the constellations. And so that was very interesting. It was sort of very constructive activity. And as time went on, when Dr. Simon was allowing Betty and Barney to remember, see, first he reinstated amnesia so that they couldn't share information. But he then worked with the two of them together so they could listen to what they said under hypnosis and talk about it. And they would come by my childhood home. My grandparents lived across the street, Betty's parents. And Betty would sit down with us and tell us everything that she and Barney had said. So I was right there with all to learn all of these revelations about these non-human entities and what actually did occur before anyone else, but I was sworn to secrecy.
I remember something about Barney's experience, that he said that they looked like they had uniforms on, and I think that he said that they looked like they had Nazi uniforms on.
What he said is that they were wearing black, shiny uniforms as he was looking up at them through binoculars. And Dr. Simon was pushing him more and more and more. Dr. Simon had said to him that he wanted him not only to tell him what happened, but things in his past that gave him the same level of fear. Now, Barney was a soldier during World War II, and when I wrote Captured, I was using records that said that he had not gone overseas. But then I found out on a program that I was watching that they did this to a lot of the African American population who were soldiers during World War II. Now, I do know when Barney returned from the war, he was in the hospital with wounds, with serious wounds. I know that he was a sharpshooter and that he was a truck driver during World War II. So I'm beginning to believe that he might have been overseas. I do know that there are letters in the archival collection, and I'm the trustee of the estate. So I have my own copy of the archival collection. The University of New Hampshire has another copy of the same thing, but mine is more extensive because of the research I've done. So Barney has correspondence from the veterans of foreign wars. And so I'm thinking that maybe he was overseas too, and I might have been incorrect when I interpreted that in the book.
How does your book, Captured, differ from John G. Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey?
My book involves my own investigation of the case and talking with all of the original investigators, having all of the files pertaining to what occurred, the Air Force files, later files. The Interrupted Journey was written by a professional writer, not a UFO researcher and investigator. And he wrote for a general audience of people who had an interest. It was a bestseller, and it traveled around the world. It was printed in several different languages. But John Fuller wrote essentially about the hypnosis. And it's not entirely accurate because when I visited his archival collection, I found letters from his publisher who said that if you don't do something about this, there will be no book.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was difficult. It was almost, there was almost not a book, because Benjamin Simon, on the other hand, was pressing for accuracy. And so it was, and was not impressed with Fuller's writing.
I understand that at some point, Dr. Simon didn't believe Betty and Barney.
He believed in their honesty. However, he had his own personal bias, and that bias was that he has not seen any evidence that UFOs are visiting our planet and abducting humans. That was his personal bias. And he essentially said to Betty and Barney, I have the private correspondence from him to them, that it will just have to wait until we know, until science has the answer. Are we being visited by UFOs? The government is finally admitting it. And Lou Elizondo recently stated that there's no reason to believe that these entities traveling in these highly advanced craft that are not from this planet wouldn't have an interest in humans. And he believed that maybe they would do the same kind of procedure that we do with animals, that catch and release procedure.
Mm-hmm. You worked with the late nuclear physicist and prominent scientific ufologist Stanton Friedman for nearly 14 years, and you wrote 3 books together. Tell us how you met and what led up to your work, and what led to your decision to write more than one book together.
Well, I think that I met Stanton for the first time in 1971 or 72. It was in that time frame when he first started speaking publicly. He'd been a nuclear physicist, and he was doing a lecture, Flying Saucers Are Real. And I I went to hear his lecture at the University of New Hampshire. And of course, he knew my aunt quite well. She might have been there. I think she probably did introduce me to him that night. And I was very impressed by Stanton because he was a hard hitter and he was accurate. He was a scientist, and he was somebody that I could place confidence in. And so I followed him over the years, and I would read his books. I went to conferences and went to his lectures. He was a wonderful lecturer, very funny, but he had all of the facts. He had all of the information to back up what he was saying. And that's something he really always stressed with me as well. So finally, it was at the MUFON Symposium in 2005 when I approached Stanton. We had already done a television show together in the White Mountains on the Hill case. And then I saw him at the conference, and I did not want to begin doing my own original research on the star map. And I always do my own original research. I don't just put faith in what anyone else has said. I want the answers and the accuracy. So I finally decided that I didn't want to do that work. It would delay the publication of the book by at least 2 years. And so I went to Stanton and I asked him if he would be interested. And he said, well, we talked together. He said, it sounds interesting, but I'm not going to tell you yes or no until I come to your house and I look at your collection and I read your manuscript. So he finally did come down. He spent a few days with my husband and myself, and we went over everything that I had. I let him copy anything that he wanted from the archival collection that I had at my house. And we talked for hours on end. And in the end, he said that he would like to work with me because I'm scientific and that our thought processes are very similar, and that I was being unbiased. And that's what he was looking for. And we worked well together.
I put on Stanton's lecture here in Lawrence around 1991. Lots of people only knew him from lectures and TV programs. What can you tell us about the man, Stanton Friedman?
Stanton was a perfect gentleman. I really admired that about him because a lot of men can be gruff and rude, but he always opened the doors. He was very good like that. And he, from his life history, he grew up in New Jersey. He was a Jewish boy who did very well in school. He also played basketball for the Young Men's Hebrew Association. And he was a very scholarly kid. In fact, he graduated from high school at the age of 16, valedictorian of his class. And Stanton came from a working class family. On his mother's side, she had brothers who were lawyers and doctors and that sort of thing. But on the father's side, they were working class. His father worked in a factory. And they simply did not have the funds to send Stanton to MIT, although he was accepted, and that was his first choice. So he ended up going to Rutgers. And, they were saying, oh, your uncles have money. And Stanton always said to me, my uncles had their own children to send through college. Why would they send Stanton through college? So he did what he could. He worked summers in the Catskill Mountains at a restaurant as a waiter. And he went to Rutgers for a couple of years. Then he transferred to the University of Chicago, had an excellent physics department, and he continued to work as a waiter to pay his way, and earned decent grades at the same time. He earned his master's degree as well in physics. And some people would always say, well, why didn't you just go on for your doctorate? And Stanton said, I wanted to go to work in industry. I didn't want to be an academic. I wanted to be a scientist in industry. That's where the interesting work is done, is what he would tell me. And so that's what he did. He had rented a room in a house from a family friend who was a divorced woman with a little boy. And over time, the little boy started to call Stanton Daddy. And Stanton fell in love with this woman, and they ended up getting married. And so they were a family moving to, trying to think where he had his first job. I think it was in Ohio. So they moved there together, and he did his work, really doing a lot of nuclear engineering, but he also had to figure out the pressure, the amount, the volume of the nuclear
propellant.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. It's hard for me to describe all this. I'm not a physicist. My background's in social science. So, although I did take physics in high school, but yes. So that was something that Stanton did. He had a successful career, but he had to move about every 3 years because it was the federally funded projects that he was working on. The funding would be cut, and then he'd go to do the same job in another city where another company was receiving funding. And it was very, very difficult for Stanton and, well, particularly for his wife and children. They had adopted a couple of children who had disabilities and needed medical care, needed special schools, and it was extraordinarily difficult for everyone, especially his wife and children. So after 14 years, he decided to call it quits. When he was working out in California, he and his wife and kids had moved there. He had started this dream job where he was going to try to back engineer a UFO, and the program funds were cut. So after like 6 months, he found out that the program was going to come to an end after, I think it was a year, and he had to decide what to do. And he was determined that he was not going to move his family again, and that he was already at that point doing radio shows, doing lectures on UFOs, and that's what he would continue to do. And when he rose to prominence in that field, there were a lot of highly respected scientists who were working in that field. So Stanton felt comfortable doing that. It was respectable.
Interesting. So let's focus on your work a little bit here. You've worked on 3 research studies on nearly 5,000 experiencers of contact. Can you tell us about the research studies, how they were put together, and what you discovered?
Yes. Well, I said I had a background in social science, and when I was in college, I worked on a research study that I had to do myself as part of a class project for sort of like a thesis, but it was a study, and also a great deal of education in statistics and in being able to determine how to formulate questions and that sort of thing. So I had quite a strong background in that and loved it. So I decided with Denise Stoner, with whom I was writing a book, that I would like to do a research study to attempt to determine the commonalities that experiencers share that are not common in the general population. And so we carried out this first study over a 1-year period. It was difficult for people to participate in it because they had to contact me and I had to send the questionnaire to them and then they had to return it to me. It wasn't online, it wasn't easy. And some of the people who have looked at that have said that they thought that probably I had a better sample, more likely to be experiencers because people had to work to do this. And so we were able to identify 23 commonalities out of 45 questions on that small study. Of only 75 participants, we had 50 experiencers and a 25-person control group. Then the second study that I worked on was with the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters, headed up by attorney Ray Hernandez, who had had his own experience, and it sort of changed the course of his life. And he had read the study that Denise and I did, and he thought he wanted to do a very large study. And large indeed, because at this point he has about 5,000 people who have participated in it. And there were social scientists who worked on that study with us as well, writing the questions. It was a long, multi-phase study. And then in social science, you always have to do these studies time and time again, and oftentimes ask the same kinds of questions. So I wanted to do another study, and to do it through the Mutual UFO Network. I was their director of experiencer research, the experiencer research team at that time, and several members of the team worked on that too. One was Dr. Michael Austin Melton, a psychologist, Dr. Don C. Dundary, who was a research psychologist and college professor at McGill University, who had a long-term interest in this study, this type of study and research, and some other people as well, lay investigators as well as academically oriented researchers. And so we ended up with 516 participants and 500 questions. No, what am I saying? A little over 100 questions. It was much smaller than Free's study. And it was a 2-phase study. And we first of all had some trick questions to eliminate the hoaxers. And then Dr. Donderi did phase 2 of that study. And that was administering the American Personality Inventory. He had worked with Bud Hopkins and with Ted Davis, who was a psychiatric social worker. And they had developed this questionnaire sort of test based on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a psychological measure. And so Dr. Donderi then did the experimental part of that with students at McGill University. And from there, he standardized it. He reduced it from 600 questions to 65 questions. And so finally, we had the API. And there were 3 categories that you could fall into when you took this test. either you had UFO abduction syndrome, or you were a simulator, or you were a member of the general public who didn't know a great deal about UFOs and abductions, and you didn't have the emotional signature or the knowledge that the experiencers or abductees had. So we were able to get some really good information that we were able to cross-reference and discover that those 3 studies confirmed the outcome of each of the studies individually. So that was really important. We found some very interesting information. I always wondered, well, do people, experiencers, generally have close encounters with craft? And do their families? And are their families experiencers? And the answer was yes, yes, and yes. We wanted to know if people were having sleep paralysis, like all of the skeptics say. It was only sleep paralysis or sleep hallucinations. And so we wanted to know how much they had conscious recall for, and we wanted to know if they had the characteristics of sleep paralysis. And what we found is that overall, only about 37%, I believe it was, of the experiencers, a very high percentage, let me correct myself, a very high percentage had sleep paralysis symptoms. But only 37% of the overall experiencer group had conscious recall of being awake, of having a light come into their home or into their environment, wherever they were, of observing non-humans and then becoming paralyzed. Among the abductee group, however, it was statistically significant, very high, about 65%, I believe it was. So those with UFO abduction syndrome certainly did score highly on this measure that we used.
I remember having sleep paralysis when I woke up once, and thank goodness that I was aware of what it was, because I'd been researching this material, and I strained and struggled as hard as I could to try and move just a fraction of an inch, and I couldn't. And it's just what the body does to keep you from acting out your dreams when you're asleep.
Yes.
And you wake up a little early sometimes.
You do. You're just a little bit out of sync during that time, but it happens very quickly. You don't remain in sleep paralysis for a long period of time. And in sleep paralysis, you might see symbols, you might see a disembodied head or part of something, but in sleep paralysis, you generally do not have a complex experience.
Mine might have lasted for 30 seconds, maybe. I was not scared at all because I knew what it was. The night that I was in bed and was terrified for some reason, I remember I heard a beeping sound from about 6 inches inside my wall. And it sounded like a trash truck going in reverse. Beep, beep, beep. And I knew from the literature what that meant. And then I became terrified. And as an insomniac, I turned right over and went to sleep.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I don't remember anything other than that. But I certainly understand people that are just fine with what they remember. When people ask me about hypnosis in regard to uncovering hidden memories, I tell them to listen to the tapes of Barney. What's your response when people purport that hypnosis is not reliable to accessing suppressed memories?
I do believe that it has a certain degree of reliability, and it depends upon the hypnotist. A hypnotist who introduces questions that might be leading will certainly, most likely, if the client has respect for that person, and respect and admiration has a lot to do with this as well. They will give answers that they think that hypnotist wants to hear, that might support that hypnotist's theories. So there is a danger there. There's also a danger for people who have read everything that has been published on the field. They watch all the shows on television, and where there isn't information, they might fill it in. But generally, hypnosis can be very accurate if it's done properly, if the proper procedures are used. If I use forensic hypnosis when I work with people.
And tell us about that.
Forensic hypnosis was developed for use in by law enforcement, and it used to be admissible in a court of law before hypnosis fell out of favor and is no longer admissible. But you do not lead the witness. You don't ask any direct questions. The only questions that you might ask are based upon what that person has just told you. So they're the ones sort of who are leading it. You're not. I've heard where some hypnotists would say to a person, okay, now you're on the craft, walk down the hallway to the room and lie down on the table and open your eyes and tell me what the room looks like. That is so leading, it's unbelievable.
And
you don't
unethical.
Even know. Yes, unethical too. You don't even know if that person's eyes were open. You don't know that person ended up on a craft. You have to begin very early, and you have to know everything about that person's history, the type of family they grew up in, their emotional self, how this happened, what they have in common with other experiencers, what kind of evidence they have that this actually did happen. Do they have photographic evidence of certain marks on their bodies, patterned marks, of fluorescence, of, they have to have a lot of evidence, at least to work with me, because I am not going to lead anyone to have an experience that didn't really happen to them. I could harm them. If it didn't happen, and you lead them to believe that it did, or you endorse their statements, you could be causing harm.
Right.
Especially if it's traumatic.
And it could be as easy as confirmation bias.
Yes.
I've heard, some hypnotists would say something like, I think Dr. Jacobs said this, that somebody would ask them, what does the alien look like? When they hadn't mentioned an alien at all.
Right.
And
yes.
that I think that Bud Hopkins would just instead say, what do you see? So as not to lead the witness.
And if they said they had their eyes closed, Bud Hopkins would say, what do you feel? What kind of sensations are you having in your body?
What can you tell us about ETs? Are they benevolent or malevolent? What messages have they given experiencers of contact?
ETs are both. They run the gamut. And it depends upon the type. That's what everybody who participated in our studies said. It depends on the type of ET. For the most part, they're businesslike. But then there are other ETs who are kind and benevolent. And then there are others who really don't care a lot about us, and they will just take whatever they want. And if you fight back, they'll beat you up. I have photographs from people I've worked with in my investigations of people who are bloody, people who are black and blue from being beaten during their struggles. So it's not nice from those who really don't care about us, maybe just think of us as dumb animals, I guess. But for the most part, one question we asked is, if you could end your experiences today, would you? And 71% of the experiencers overall said no, they would not end it. 74% of the abductee group said they would not end it. And in Free's study, it was 83% who wouldn't end it. So the majority of people are not having these horrific experiences.
Or at least they think they aren't.
Well, they're not being beaten up.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
And you know, the memories that they have are of receiving love from these entities, being told that they're family, that they're not going to be harmed. They told Betty and Barney, we're not going to harm you. We only need to do
special.
A few simple tests. Yeah, well, not that many are told that they're special. That was one of the questions we asked. That was a fairly low percentage who said
really?
They were told they were special. Yes.
In Dr. Jacobs' research, it seems like an overwhelming majority of experiencers have mentioned either that they were told that they were special, especially when they were young, or something like that.
They were told that they were valued, that they were part of a program. This is what I've found on the research studies that I've done. They're told that they volunteered to be part of this program. Some, quite a percentage of these experiencers, are told that they made this agreement before they came into this current lifetime to participate in this in order to increase Earthlings' awareness, to help to save this planet. And that goes along with the messages that we found overwhelmingly. The messages are environmentally oriented, a great concern about our failure to be good stewards to our environment, and also about nuclear weapons. They are extraordinarily concerned about our use of nuclear weapons. And they tell people that, you know, the reason that they have to take tissue samples, for example, is because they are testing the level of toxicity, environmental toxicity, in the human body. And so that makes some sense to me. Yeah. Particularly among people who grow up in highly toxic environments around bodies of water that are toxic, around industries, toxic industries around nuclear power plants, nuclear bases, that sort of thing. And I have spoken with a lot of children of nuclear scientists and engineers and people who worked closely with the military, who are experiencers, and a lot of people who serve in the military who were taken.
You wrote the Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner, who you mentioned before. Tell us about how you met Denise, who she is, and how you decided to work together.
Okay. Well, I did live in New Hampshire, and my husband and I moved to Florida. And when I moved to Florida, I decided that I wanted to become involved in the Florida MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. And Denise was one of the officers in MUFON. She was holding a meeting. And so I just went unannounced to the meeting one day, and she recognized me, but she did not want to point me out because she didn't know if I wanted others to know that I was there. And she invited me to some private meetings that she held just for experiencers too. And so I went to those, and then she invited me to her house for lunch, where she told me privately that she was an experiencer, and that back in um, the 1980s, she and her husband and her daughter were traveling through Colorado. They lived near Denver, and they were traveling to their summer place. They did this every weekend during the summer. They'd meet Denise's parents and a family friend there. They'd all have dinner together. So they arrived at the same time every weekend in the summer. And she didn't remember the year at the time. She didn't remember the date. She only knew that Ed had been in the military. Ed is her husband. And he was doing everything military style. So he was recording the mileage and running the trip odometer, and he'd stop at the same place. He'd stop at the top of Kenosha Pass and 10,000 foot pass, and have a little snack and look down over the town of Jefferson and the valley below. And this particular night, as they were descending down the road from the path, they saw two lights in the sky that were moving very, very rapidly toward their vehicle. And Denise felt the vehicle lift up and sort of slide to the side. She spoke to Ed, and he looked like he was in a trance, and his hands were holding the wheel very tightly. And then the next thing, let me say first, it was still daylight when they were there, 6 o'clock at night. And then the next thing they knew, it was about 11 o'clock. It was cold. It was dark. They were at the top of a pass 40 miles away, Trout Creek Pass, and didn't know what had happened. They remembered seeing those lights in the sky, and then they drove on, talked to Denise's parents about it. The parents were very upset. They didn't know where Ed and Denise were. Had they been in an accident? They were walking up to a ranch house where they were going to ask to use the telephone to call the highway patrol. So I was very interested in this because it was so similar to what happened to my aunt and uncle. And so I did separate hypnosis with Denise and with Ed, and reinstated amnesia, and followed the same procedure, and discovered that they had, of course, been taken to craft, and made a very, very interesting story. And it was not just one experience. Denise ended up telling me that she believed she had been taken from the time she was 3. Well, I know a lot about human development, and 3-year-olds tend to be fantasy prone. So I say, well, that's uncertain. Let's stay with what we know, what we have evidence for. So it made a very interesting case study and investigation. And Denise wrote her input in the book about her feelings, what she felt had happened. And from the time she was young, I wrote my investigation and an analysis of what Denise said. We weren't friends. when we started working together, but we did become friends because I discovered what a great investigator she is. She's probably the best UFO investigator I've ever met. In fact, when MUFON was receiving funding from Robert Bigelow, she was one of the people who was selected. She was on the STAR team. Bigelow bought her equipment to use to do an investigation.
And although we have kind of an intermediate audience, can you describe what the STAR team was?
Okay, sure. Well, the STAR team were an advanced group of field investigators for the Mutual UFO Network. So they were sort of the cream of the crop, those who were highly experienced. And Denise was one of those people who had her bag packed, and she was ready to pick up her bag and get onto a plane at a moment's notice to fly out to wherever it was. And I really have a great deal of respect for her. When I was MUFON's director of the Experiencer Research Team, Denise was my personal assistant, and she remains the personal assistant to Gwen Farrell, who is the new director. And Denise is also MUFON's state assistant director.
Awesome.
In Florida.
One of my mods, Canadian Spider-Man, says, that is really high praise. Highly skilled investigators are so important. And that's
Absolutely.
very true.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you about this book that you wrote with Stanton Friedman. And I'm going to make myself big here so people can see. Science was wrong. What can you tell us about this book and some of your other books with Stan?
Yes, well, after we worked on Captured, Stanton got in touch with me and said, "How would you like to write another book with me?" And I said, "Well, tell me about it." And he said, "Well, I want to do a book on It's Impossible, Isn't It?" That was the original title he had, because that's what scientists throughout history have said. It's impossible. It can't be. And that's what scientists, mainstream scientists, said for so many years. And a lot of them are still saying about UFOs. It's impossible. They can't get here from there. So I said, well, that sounds like a great project, Stanton. We each wrote 7 chapters. And we had... It was very, very interesting because only 2 chapters were on UFOs and ET contact, alien abduction. We have chapters on, I wrote on hemophilia and the devastating impact that it had, the blood supply that had AIDS or HIV contaminated with hepatitis C, the impact that had on people with hemophilia who needed these blood transfusions and became very, very ill and died as a result, and the political part of that too. I wrote on the smallpox vaccine, the development of that and the resistance to it and the false information that was disseminated about it. I wrote on Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a medical doctor in Austria, who was originally from, Budapest. I think it was Budapest. And how he was concerned because the medical doctors who were being trained would go into the hospitals after they had spent the morning doing autopsies on cadavers of women who had died from childbed fever. They hadn't washed their hands, they'd just wiped them on dirty aprons. And Ignaz Semmelweis had developed a hand washing technique so that these trainees would stop infecting these women. And Semmelweis was thrown out. He was not obedient. He would not agree with the zeitgeist of the old guard. He was thrown out of the hospital. He went back to Budapest, and he practiced medicine there using his techniques. And it wasn't until after his death that he was finally recognized as being right. But those opponents said, how could doctors who spend their lives healing people be harming people? That was the great difficulty. I wrote about contamination in Japan, methyl mercury contamination, which, by the way, has spread to the bottoms of lakes around the world at this point, and the devastating effect that it has on not only the children and the adults in Japan that it first impacted, but on Native Americans as well, around the Great Lakes and in other places. So those are just some of the chapters that I wrote. Stanton wrote on the history of aerospace technology.
I was just about to say, I remember Stan saying something about an astronomer's proclamation in the years running up to Apollo 11 that to break Earth's gravity, they would need 1,000,000 pounds of thrust, and that this astronomer was off by a factor of 10.
Yes, yes. Stanton just loved quoting people who were so wrong, but who were people that other people listened to, and people who criticized those who were correct.
I find it personally very interesting that Stan and Carl Sagan were college classmates, and that Carl, who was, one of my heroes when I was a little kid, wrote 14 articles in Parade magazine against UFO reality. When, shouldn't he be teaching college or something? and he was so anti-UFO, and I believe came up with the phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, or if he didn't, he at least used it a lot.
Yes, yes.
Stan, I think, had a really interesting and personal view about Carl, and I think he thought that Carl was either a skeptic or a debunker. What are your thoughts?
I have the same thoughts about Carl Sagan, and that gets to our book, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers, which is the third book we did together. We did a great deal of archival research on that at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and we stayed with our friend Jennifer Stein, and she helped us with our research as well. And we discovered letters that were written by Dr. Donald Menzel, who was an astrophysicist at Harvard, who Stanton had discovered
led a double life.
Led a double life. He had a very long history with naval intelligence and then with the CIA and the NSA. And he wrote a letter to Carl Sagan early on in Carl's career, because Carl was very open-minded in the beginning. But then Donald Menzel said in this letter, when I was a young man, I bucked the system, and I discovered that when I respected my elders and went along with them, I did much better. And look at all of the things I've achieved in my life. Now, Donald Menzel was very closely connected to the military and the federal government, as I said.
And was a member of Majestic 12, right?
Yes, that he's on the list of people who were members of Majestic 12. Stanton found a document after searching for, I think it was 11 years in archives, that confirmed there actually was a Majestic 12 group who were going to meet at the White House. And so he was sort of a double agent. He liked to doodle a lot of pictures of aliens. And when he made statements of impossibility, he had not investigated these cases. He did what the CIA was asking scientists to do. He wrote his first anti-UFO book in 1953. It was published in 53. And in January of 1953, the CIA funded Robertson panel met and decided policy for UFOs and how they were going to handle the public. And one of those ways was to have scientists write books and articles on speculation, essentially, logical deduction regarding UFOs, rather than on the evidence. And that's what Donald Menzel did, and that's what Carl Sagan ended up doing too.
Mm-hmm. Although I think it can still be said of Carl Sagan that some of his books like Contact and The Demon Haunted World are of some use.
Yes.
In general, I really wish he'd sort of been on our team, you know?
Mm-hmm. I do too. And, you know, I have his book, The Demon Haunted World. I found it very interesting. And I saw the movie Contact. I haven't read the book.
It's a great book.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a great movie.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Lou Elizondo earlier.
Yes.
So with everything that's happened since December of 2017, when, you know, the news came out via Politico and the New York Times above the fold and all that kind of thing, and nobody really batted an eye. Do you think that these things are coming here from other planets, or are they living here on Earth secretly, or are they from some other dimension? All of the above? What do you think?
It's a really difficult question to answer. I suspect that some of them are coming here from other planets, from star systems in our own galaxy. I also, and they might be interdimensional. They have interdimensional technology. They can move people through walls. They can move themselves through walls. I've talked to physicists about this, and they've told me that it is possible to do that. And in fact, we have had atoms of the same that we've been able to align the frequency and phase of, and they have interpenetrated on a very small scale using neutrinos. So we're a long way, much more primitive in our technology than they are. But it appears that they're able to do that, unless they're simply interdimensional and they can walk from another dimension through walls. But I think that there's more going on. I think there are some interdimensional entities. Think of the fairies, the brownies, the
Sure.
long history.
The Tommyknockers. Yeah.
And a funny thing is, in one of the cases that I investigated over a number of years, I was up in Winnipeg, the experiencer was able to capture a lot of like orbs in his home on camera. One healed him, for example. He had cancer. I have the reports. And But he did capture an entity standing in the doorway to his bedroom. And so I did a photo analysis on that.
So when
And
when
you
you
know
said he
what?
captured an entity, you mean
On
he took
camera,
a
on
on
film,
camera? Okay.
on film. Sorry about that. Should be clear. And I looked at that and I said, that's not an ET. That's a fairy or an elf. There was this big head with a really square and long jawline and kind of a little brownie hat. And
And how
boy,
tall would this creature have been?
it was only about 3 feet tall, 2.5 to 3 feet tall. It was very tiny. Yeah.
Interesting.
It is interesting to see something like that, and so that makes me question, well, are ETs coming through an interdimensional vortex, and are these other dimensional entities also entering if that vortex is left open? That's just speculation. I don't know for certain, but I do now try to theorize and talk to scientists about what I'm learning to help them to put all of this together.
Yeah, a lot of it's fun to think about. Not too long ago, I attended a virtual seminar in which you were involved for the Travis Walton documentary by Jennifer Stein. Can you tell us about it and what your involvement with it was?
Yes. Well, Jennifer asked me to appear in her movie, and I had investigated the Travis Walton case. I'd been out there. I walked on the land. I've talked to Travis many times. I've talked to men who worked with him, were involved in the case. I've been to the courthouse with law enforcement people who were there at the time as well, who are still living. And I developed an interest in Philip Klass's debunking of the Travis Walton case. And because there was quite a lot of evidence that it was real. And so, again, at the American Philosophical Society, which, by the way, Dr. Donald Menzel was on the board of directors of, and Philip Klass has his archival collection there, as well as Menzel having his. And I read all of the letters that Philip Klass wrote regarding all of this. And I discovered that he also made recordings, and then he transcribed the recordings into words and written word. And Mike, who worked, he was Travis's boss.
Mike
Travis
Rogers.
was taken. Yeah, Mike Rogers told me that he corresponded with Phil Klass for many years, and he thought that Phil knew the truth, but it was like a job that he had to do to distort the truth. And he distorted everything, that every conversation that he had with Mike. And Mike would confront him and say, tell the truth. That's not what I said. And, so that sort of thing was occurring. And Philip Klass was interested in doing, having everyone involved in that case have polygraph exams. And the only thing is, Philip Klass had a requirement, and that was he had to choose the polygraph examiner, and he had to be present. Now, anyone who has studied the polygraph exams, know that you can fail a polygraph exam even if you're telling the truth by introducing someone who upsets you emotionally. And if you have a polygraph examiner who wants to prove you, to say that you are lying, then they can word questions in such a way so that you can fail it or can look like that you're not telling the complete truth. So I know that Philip Klass had this plan in mind, and it never happened. Travis Walton, of course, has taken several polygraph examinations that he passed, even after he failed the first one when he was just so terribly distraught, emotionally upset, in a state of shock. But he passed the other ones. But there is a television show that Travis was on, and it was a polygraph show, and I think that it was Michael Shermer, the skeptic, who came out and stirred Travis up. Travis had passed every other question asked, and Michael Shermer was brought out at the end just before the last question, and Travis failed it. He was too upset over Shermer's presence.
That's not fair. And
no, it's not fair.
Everybody knows that Michael Shermer is a debunker.
Yes, absolutely.
So tell me, what were your thoughts after the film, the virtual convention? How did you think that it came off? And have you talked to Jennifer Stein about it since then?
I haven't talked to Jennifer Stein, and you didn't see me lecturing in the virtual convention, did you?
No.
No, I wasn't there. I was working, I think, someplace else that weekend. So I'm not sure. I have a lot of communication with Jennifer, and worked with her on some research, giving her information that I have. So I really can't comment on the conference itself. Do you want to tell me about it?
I thought it was very interesting in that everybody got to sort of build an avatar of themselves. You could walk it around and meet people and go to the bar, have a drink, and chat with other people. I was just pretty glued to the screen. I just sat down, so to speak, and watched people talk and watched the documentary, which I hadn't seen. I ended up ordering the $35 package, which has a poster that's autographed by Travis, which I thought was pretty nifty. He is somebody that's definitely been on my radar to interview for a long time. And my head is still reeling a little bit with what you told me about the Michael Shermer thing. A lot of people, just think, you've got those satellite dishes pointed in the wrong direction. But I really think that he's like Philip Klass, being paid by the government to poo-poo UFOs. For instance, Phil Klass offered Mike Rogers $10,000 to lie about the Travis Walton experience, and he just turned him down. And he was able to report that, Philip Klass offered me $10,000 to lie about what happened. And where does
Steve Pierce $10,000?
Oh, was it Steve Pierce?
Yes, it was Steve Pierce. He was the youngest one on the team, and he was the one that Phil Klass thought that he could get to. In fact, I have the conversation that Phil Klass had with a woman at the courthouse wanting to know about all of these different individuals who were working with Travis that day, and their characteristics, who would be the easiest to get to. And so class targeted Steve Pierce.
Yeah, he probably already asked who had criminal backgrounds and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when you ask yourself, how does this writer for Aviation Week in Review get $10,000 to pay this guy, and who successfully paid Stanton Friedman $10,000 for examples of something? I don't remember what it was.
1,000. It was supposed to be. It would have been 10,000, but Stanton settled for 1,000.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought that he said up to 10.
Yes, he did. $1,000 a piece, I think it was, for up to 10. It's all in our book, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers.
Right.
And Stanton produced more than 10, but he settled on 10. And I have a copy of the check. It's in the book, too. And I'm quite certain it was 1,000.
And just one,
Stanton
not 10.
settled for. That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I thought I heard something about a condition that Phil Klass had set that was up to 10. And people don't even know what we're talking about. Examples of...
they're talking about the typeset.
Right,
the
for
font.
the MJ12 documents.
On typewriters in the White House. And Philip Klass said that they were all, I think, pica, and this was an elite font, and so it couldn't possibly be real. And so they had that bet, and Stanton actually did go to the archive, and he was able to acquire many copies, indicating that he was right. Both types of typewriters were in the White House. And it was for the MJ12 document.
Yeah. Just going to highlight some comments here. One thing that I wanted to ask you, Kathleen, is you have very generously offered to give away an autographed copy of What to Do When You've Been Abducted, or an Ask Kathleen Anything valued at $50. Can you tell us about what that is?
Yes, well, I work with experiencers via my website. You can purchase this for $50, and it's for a 1-hour Zoom conversation to help people, because I have a way of making people feel comfortable, people who might be frightened, and I have a tremendous amount of knowledge that I can share with people. So it's Ask Kathleen Anything, because not everybody has been abducted. There are a lot of people who would just like to ask me questions about my work, to answer any questions that they might have. So I wanted to give people the opportunity to have either that $50 Zoom meeting with me to ask me anything they want. I've studied all facets of this study. I've written books on all facets of it as well. And then the book, Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted, is not just for experiencers. It's a comprehensive guide for experiencers, but I have written about some of my best cases in it. It's a very interesting book for just probably anyone from the general population who has an interest in that topic.
Very good. Let me get back to my cheat sheet here. I did want to ask you if you have ever experienced contact.
Well, I think that I might possibly have. When I was 17 years old, my Aunt Betty was doing an experiment with a team of scientists to try to call in a craft to land on my grandparents' farm.
Mm-hmm.
And they would script her. They would give her something to read, and they'd have the longitude and the latitude, they'd have the location and a lot of information. And when they wanted this to happen, so many days into our year. And one did come in, and it landed. My grandmother saw it come in. One of our neighbors, who was a commercial pilot, saw it coming in as well. It left physical trace evidence on the ground. It was investigated. My mother and I both had memories of finding ourselves on a craft. And it was investigated confidentially. We were never going to speak about this. My mother never spoke about it publicly. It was investigated by Dr. James Harder, who was the head investigator for APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. He hypnotized both of us as well. And so there's a good possibility that we were taken.
And like many other people, I assume you're happy to let sleeping dogs lie.
Yeah, I don't want to go. I've had hypnosis. I don't want to go into all of the details.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's very personal.
Sure. Fair enough.
And I'm a researcher. I'm an author. And that's what I want to do. I don't want to cast myself as an experiencer and this and this and this happened to me, and how I felt when it was happening, that sort of thing.
Still, I think it must put experiencers at ease to be gently guided through, these memories by someone that has been through the experience, rather than experts like John Mack and Dr. David Jacobs, who, as far as we know, didn't have any experiences.
It does. People are very comfortable with me. And as I said before, it helps them to calm down when they speak with me. And that's important. It's terrible to go through life being frightened that this might happen again. So many people sleep with their lights on, or they don't sleep at all during the night. People lose their jobs if they have daytime jobs because
I used to wait until 3:30 a.m. before I'd go to sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, a lot of people couldn't sleep alone. People would sleep with other people because of this possibility, and thought they wouldn't be taken if somebody else was there with them. People did all sorts of things. They'd drink themselves to sleep.
Yep.
It's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to have the statistical information for people. The statistics are in that book. And some insight, some knowledge that we've been able to acquire, and I have been able to acquire through my investigations. And in the book, I've talked about good experiences, horrific experiences, and everything in between as well. So it's very complex, but the majority of people are not being injured. They might be
Right.
frightened. The major problem is they don't know what happened. They have heard others talking about these horrific entities who abuse humans, who treat us like lab rats, who kill us. Some people say that. Some people even say they're eating us. I've never worked with a person in all my life who has disappeared.
No.
And people are frightened. Those things really bother people. And I just have a way of reassuring people that no, I never have worked with anyone. I've never spoken with anyone who has simply disappeared. And very few of the people I've worked with have been harmed. And for the most part, it's black and blue marks because they were resisting.
Right. Which brings me to the idea that when Travis first awakened, his vision was really blurry, but then it clarified, and he saw that he wasn't in a hospital, which he had assumed, and that he wasn't being operated on by doctors and nurses like he assumed. And once he saw these things, he freaked out, and he started hitting them, or one, and they all just sort of moved away and left the room, which seems to be a much better situation than getting beat up.
Absolutely. Calvin Parker, for example, had kind of a horrific experience where they drew blood from him. And I did hypnosis with Calvin a couple of
Oh,
years
you
ago.
did?
Yes.
Yeah, my
And
understanding is that he was waiting until he could get free so that he could pop that bitch, and he did, and that did not go well for him after that.
no, it did not go well for him at all. And I always recommend to people that it's better to project love than fear or hatred. Because if these entities are negative entities, they are going to leave if you're projecting love, and that's not what they want. And Calvin, I guess, sort of popped her, and she took revenge on him. And in the end, I think that she was so angry with him, even before he tried to kill her, that I believe it's because she had been showing him images of nuclear war.
Armageddon. Mm-hmm.
Yes, of people's faces melting off. And he worked in the nuclear industry. His father was a commissioner in the nuclear industry in his state. And so Calvin was a driller, but she wanted him to stop doing nukes. She wanted him to educate the public on the possibility that nuclear war could kill everything on this planet, cause an environmental collapse. He never did that. He continued doing what he was doing. That's one reason I believe that she was so angry with him.
He mentioned, I think, that she was evil and she
Yes.
wanted to kill him.
Well, what she did is she cut his hand, and the blood was dripping out of his hand into something below, some
Oh, a
kind of
receptacle. That's right. Yeah.
that she had. And he actually ended up having a near-death experience.
Wow.
Now, did she do that intentionally so that he would have a near-death experience and develop the characteristics that people have of becoming more spiritually oriented, of becoming more psychic, of becoming empathic, where you can feel another person's emotions as if they're your own. Was she doing that? Those are characteristics that many experiencers share. I don't know, but I question that.
It seems like Calvin Parker didn't really want to talk about it for a long time, and then just recently sort of did. And I saw, maybe it was part of Jennifer's film. No, it was something else, where they had gathered about half a dozen witnesses that had been around the Pascagoula abduction.
Mm-hmm.
They hadn't necessarily seen Charles Hickson or Calvin Parker, but they had seen the UFO. They'd seen it leave. They'd seen it come. There were people around the river. I think there was a guy in a crane, and it really was a great help to Calvin, because even after all these years, he said, it helped me feel like I wasn't insane.
Absolutely. And it's great to have that kind of confirmation that there were other people who were afraid to come forward because of the disinformants who were so nasty to any witnesses in that time frame. So these people apparently felt that the environment for coming forward is much better today than it was years ago. Back in 1973 when that happened. Long time ago.
Yeah, it is. I remember when I was young, I had a book that was a paperback, but it was sort of a encyclopedia of UFOs. Mm-hmm. And it had an illustration of an alien, I guess, and it had kind of a square head, and it was making some kind of a beckoning motion and had one arm over here. And every time I read that book, I read it over and over, I made sure to skip that page because it scared me to death. Mm-hmm. I could not handle it.
And there's robots or biomechanical robots that took Calvin and Charlie Hickson, and then in a later abduction, just Calvin, were not nice. They had a job to do. They came, they took them, they elevated them above the ground and floated them into the craft, and then stood against the wall and didn't move unless they were told to move. And later in Calvin's abduction, when he was fishing and he was taken by that skinny woman, I think she might have been an insectoid, sort of disguised. Mm-hmm. When he was taken, then there was one in the room standing against the wall. And when Calvin had this woman by the neck beating her head against the wall, she let out a sound that he told me sounded like a mating call of an alligator. And then this entity came over and did something to Calvin's arm.
Separate them.
Yeah, kind of a buzzing or an injection that made him calm.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
He reported several injections, mm-hmm. which, as soon as I heard that, made me think about my labs and how Leah Haley, Carla Turner, for whose homage the show is named, and others reported either injections or I think Leah Haley said that she could see the stitching between the eye and the rest of the mask that these children were wearing. Really strange stuff.
So many people who are taken by these insectoid type entities say false face. They're wearing masks. That's not what they really look like.
Yeah, I've had an experience not unlike that, where I said, I know that's not what you really look like, and got a little more than I bargained for.
Did they show you what they do look like? What did you see?
Very elephantine skin, very wrinkly, almost like a very old person, but I didn't get the impression that that being was particularly old. Just that was the way that their skin actually looked like. It wasn't smooth like, on the cover of Communion, that kind of thing. So,
and how tall was this entity?
well, this was a holographic projection.
Oh, holographic projection. Okay.
I initially was attracted to some movement on my TV when it was off, and this was again when I was in my bedroom getting ready to go to sleep, and this sort of image appeared on my screen when my TV was off, and I said, "That's not what you really look like. Show me what you really look like," and it did. And that was the last time I asked anything like that.
I had a dream one time where I was taken to craft, and there was one entity in this dream who was like at a desk, and it was obviously wearing a mask. And I said, I've known you for so many years. Won't you please tell me or show me what you look like? And it removed the mask, and it had a face like an insect. It was really frightening.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it was a dream. I don't
Yeah.
think it was real.
It's interesting going through Dr. Jacobs' research with the insectolins and all the different kinds that seem to be, at least from what I've been able to recollect, sort of like the insectoids are running the show. That the grays, if they aren't biorobotic creatures, like you said, are some kind of hybrid between us and the insectolins, and so on down, to the hybrids, as he
Right.
calls them.
I have all of his books, and
Yeah.
from the research that I have worked on, the most prevalent group are the Nordic types. And then after that are a number of races of grays, both tall, 5 feet tall or so. They, according to experiencers, seem to be sentient beings. They age, I've been told. But then there are the smaller ones that appear to be biorobotic. Some people will disagree with that. I know they believe that they're sentient beings too. But the small ones just have a job to do. They're the assistants, they're the police officers. They won't let you leave the craft with anything that belongs to them. The taller ones are the physicians, the educators, that sort of thing. And that's what I have learned in the research studies that I've worked on with about 5,000 experiencers total. Now, the third most prevalent are what David Jacobs calls insectolins, or I often say insectoid, and a lot of people say mantis types.
Yeah.
And they do seem to have a lead role when they're working on craft, oftentimes with small grays, and sometimes with both sizes of grays as well. So, I don't know how all that fits together. A lot of people say that these mantis types are very kind and caring and have a great personality. But, that goes against everything that people have told David Jacobs, that, that they're just producing a hybrid race and that they're going to supplant us.
Yeah. It is scary stuff. And we've reached the point in the broadcast where I would like to encourage everybody in the chat to follow the URL on your screen to be eligible to win either a copy of Kathleen's book, Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted, or a free consultation to ask Kathleen anything valued at $50. And we'll leave that up on the screen for a little bit, and then we will be joined by Antiderivative Jill, who will get all of the names on a wheel for us and then spin it, and we'll have our giveaway for the week. And Kathleen, I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you think that we didn't touch on that you would like to in our waning minutes?
Oh my gosh. We've covered a great deal. I'm writing a new book. I just submitted it to my publisher today, so I'm hoping that it will be published within the next few months. And it involves my own life, my experiences, not in a great detail of what happened to me. There's a little bit about that. But the life that I've lived, the research, and also a study that I did. I was very interested in Wilbert Smith, who worked for the Canadian government, and Rear Admiral Herbert Knowles. And my Aunt Betty Hill knew Admiral Knowles. He, once he retired, was on the board of directors of NICAP, actually, but he lived right across the river from Betty. He was in Maine. And she and Barney actually would go to his house for brunch with members of the Canadian military and researchers and psychics, all sorts of people, and all interested in UFOs. And so there was a woman, her name was Frances Swann, and she had an experience where suddenly these extraterrestrials started downloading information into her. And so she would write it all out as quickly as she could. It's a very long story, but to be brief, I was able to acquire correspondence files between these two men. And what an eye-opening experience that was. I've written about that in the new book, and about what they learned about these ETs way back in 1954, and about the Canadian government and the US government's interest in this. And a letter even went to Dwight Eisenhower.
Wow.
So, yeah, I have a lot to say about that. And I always thought that channelers, that sort of thing, was a little kooky. So I never did anything regarding that. But after I did this research, I thought, well, if these scientists can do it, if the federal government is interested, well, maybe I will form a scientific team. And there happened to be a man who had contacted me, he in fact lives in my town, who has been an experiencer since he was 8 years old, but more recently has begun communicating. And for a period of 2 years, we met once a month to ask questions and also to receive evidence. And that's all going to be in this new book, too, when it's published soon.
I can't wait.
I'm really excited about it.
That sounds great. And here is Antiderivative Jill. Hello, Jill. Your mute is on.
Hello there.
There you go. So, how many people do we have on the wheel today?
8.
And did you put all the mods on?
Yes. Oh, wait a second. I didn't put... We have more mods than I put here. We also have... Tonight, I saw another mod here. Who was it? Gap Stargate? He was here. Should I add him too?
If he's not in the chat at present, we should probably leave him off.
Okay, in that case, then, yes, I added all the mods.
Okay, great. Then let's give it a spin, and we'll see who our big winner is. Congratulations, Ivan Ivanovich.
Congratulations.
And I will get his information to you, Kathleen.
Okay.
And we will let him pick a personal consultation with you or a copy of your book.
If he lives in the United States.
Yes, he does. He is actually a rather prodigious winner here on our show, but it's absolutely random. So,
So congratulations, Yvonne.
Yes, and he says, "I'll take the book." So there we go.
Okay.
And yes, congratulations. Kathleen, I do want to thank you very much for taking the time out to talk with us and answer some great questions with some great answers. And we're definitely looking forward to your new book. Can you tell us where we can find the books you've written already?
All of my books are available at online bookstores. If you would like an autographed copy and you live in the United States, you can purchase that from my website at Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com. I'll send it to you right away, and just let me know if you want me to personalize it with your name. And bookstores, there aren't many bookstores left anymore.
No, there aren't.
But you might be able to find them in a physical bookstore, or you can certainly order them from physical bookstores. They're all professionally published. I don't self-publish.
Great. Well, it has been a very enlightening evening, and I would like to invite you to come back and join us sometime soon. And we're almost at the 2-hour mark, so I will thank my mods, and especially Antiderivative Jill, who
You're welcome.
isn't really sure why I try and imitate Boris Karloff when I say that. But for Kathleen Marden and the mods, it's Cardinal Sin, and we're